Keep your radio tuned to 90.7 FM WNCU Durham.
The opinions expressed on the following program do not necessarily represent the opinions of this station, its sponsors, or North Carolina Central University.
Good afternoon and welcome to WNCU 90.7 FM's First Lunch and Learn for Black History Month. We've all heard the term critical race theory, but what does it mean to all Americans? It depends on who you ask. Today, we're asking educator and CEO of Drakeford, Scott and Associates LLC, Dr. Derrick Drakeford, and English language specialist Dr. Warren Christian to talk about critical race theory and Dr. Drakeford's book, Inclusion, The Art of Story Listening. We're WNCU 90.7 FM. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello. RTP, Durham, Carrboro, the Triangle, Raleigh. Where you at? I am Dr. Derrick Drakeford. Welcome to the first of 4 Lunch and Learn programs for Black History Month here on WNCU 90.7 FM. I'm here along with the talented English language specialist Dr. Warren Christian to talk about critical race theory and the art of story listening. Dr. Warren, how you doing?
Good. Dr. Drakeford, thanks so much for having me on. Excited to be here in this studio where it all goes down.
It goes down. We're following Dr. Holly. Wow.
Those big footsteps. It's so cool to watch him work.
So I think many people want to know, from my perspective as an African-American professor, but also from your perspective as a white male professor, our points of view on critical race theory, and our specialty is really in education, so how it affects education, how we teach our kids, and what we should teach our kids. What's your nutshell definition of critical race theory?
I think this would have been a lot easier to give a couple years ago before people started talking about CRT, wanting to ban critical race theory. Because then it was an academic subdiscipline coming out of critical legal studies, theories like intersectionality, kind of the idea that with the lens that racism is baked into the U.S., that racism is the rule and not the exception. That would have been a much easier conversation. But now, a couple years ago, now that everyone wants to ban CRT, especially in K-12 education, is much more complicated because CRT isn't taught. Critical race theory has never been taught in kindergarten, first grade, up through 12th grade in high schools.
It's really been a weaponizing of the term to remove certain parts of American history that some people don't like.
Exactly. And I think one thing that's been so successful and so kind of devious and smart about the way these folks who want to ban it have done it is, well, they've got people like me saying, well, that's not being taught in schools anyway. And then you're going to get me going on a debate about what is and is not critical race theory. When in fact, what it seems like exactly what they're banning is just an open and honest discussion of race and racism in the U.S. and the racism of the founding fathers, the white supremacy present in the Constitution. And I mean, basically the fact that when they said all men are created equal, these were people who owned slaves. That clearly was not what they actually meant.
That's a contradiction. So yeah, critical race theory comes out of the legal field. Professor Derrick Bell and others in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There are multiple tenets or kind of conceptual ideas of critical race theory. Today we're going to focus on one of those, and that is counter-storytelling. Some of the other tenets are the prominence of racism, whiteness as property, which can be passed from white individuals to non-white individuals, interest convergence, and the critique of liberalism. But today we're really going to focus on what I believe of the tenets is the most solution-focused, and that is counter-storytelling. Counter-storytelling is presenting a narrative that is counter to the dominant narrative. And I think this past year and this past season, when we all witnessed the George Floyd murder, we witnessed a counter story, right? The dominant narrative is that the police are going to protect you. They love you. They care about you. These are good guys. And in that video, we saw a story and a narrative that's counter to that. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. And it's not the first time we've seen that story, and it keeps happening. And it seems like the big difference now is we get it on video, and then we see it over and over, and it's incontrovertible. And it happens to so many folks in ways that, when it's not captured on video, or where there's some small mitigating factor that never should result in the ending of someone's life. But to see it so clearly with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice, and the list just goes on, and you can't ignore it. It's there in front of you. It's on video. The trauma is happening over and over. And you can't wish it away. It's harder to ignore in that sense.
And what I've found in my research is that most black people know the counter narrative. They've lived the counter narrative. They fully understand the counter narrative. So where the counter narrative is most impactful is with people who are not familiar with the counter narrative. And that's what the work of our research and this book, The Art of Story Listening, is trying to do. I know you have the intro of the book there kind of itching in your hands. Dr. Warren, go ahead and read that.
Okay, so just as a caveat, this was written in 2017, so right after Trump had been elected. But just to your point, before I get into it, that's something too. Before Trump got elected, I was there's no way this can't happen. The man is running on racism. This racism is his platform. He came down the escalator. He said Mexicans are raping people. Just from the start to the end, one of his main things seemed to be racism, and just thought, well, this guy can't win. Now, most of the black folks I know knew exactly he could win on this. And so that, I feel embarrassed at the thought that I thought, well, this just isn't going to happen. Even to the point where I thought, well, I hope the Republicans do nominate him, because he'll lose so badly. And boy, was I wrong.
Then that goes to some of our challenges around CRT, is that it is being used just like Mexicans coming down the escalator. So it's really being used to rile up people without fully understanding. But go ahead, Doc.
That's right. Okay, here we go. The resurgence of overt white supremacy, exemplified by the 2017 white riot in Charlottesville, Virginia, was disheartening to those who imagined that the United States has continued, however slowly, on a path towards greater racial equality. Even while less overt forms of systemic and institutional racism have continued, one could be forgiven for hoping that as a country we had outgrown the more overt forms of racial violence typified by lynching. The resurgence of the KKK, neo-Nazis, and Nazis, and the public emergence of the white supremacist alt-right call into question whether we can even claim that racism has at least become less overt and violent. The movement for Black Lives implores that we recognize that the violence against black bodies has not subsided, but rather has been formalized and continues to be sponsored by the state. The election to president of a man who continually questioned the legitimacy of the first African-American president and publicly campaigned for 5 black men, the Central Park Five, to be executed for a crime for which they were falsely accused, further show that we have not come as far as we may have hoped. On a broader scale, the already inadequate social safety net is threatened. This displays an acceptance of the idea that not everyone deserves to enjoy adequate food, shelter, or health care. Recent gains for the LGBTQ community are threatened. Immigrant families are at risk of being torn apart. Islamophobia has become a pillar of foreign and domestic policy. All of this is concerning, to say the least. How does one go about changing this? Or more simply, how does one survive or even thrive in such circumstances? In Inclusion, The Art of Story Listening, Derrick Drakeford, right here, offers a possible answer, empathy. While formal racial segregation has been outlawed for over 60 years and been nominally enforced for over 45 years, social segregation is still quite common. In a society that is still so segregated, inclusion offers that radical story listening can provide a bridge to empathy. When we read a novel or listen to a story, we don't find the character most similar to ourselves and identify with them. Instead, we usually identify with the main character, no matter how different they may be from ourselves. The autoethnographies collected herein provide a chance to empathize with those who are different from ourselves. While we can never fully understand the experiences of others or contemplate the discrimination and subjugation of those different from us, this book provides the opportunity to learn more and to practice the skill of empathy. This book is important because in addition to the overt displays of white supremacy exemplified in Charlottesville and the systematic racism that sees more money and resources funneled to whiter schools and more severe punishments for people of color, there also exist the more banal, everyday forms of racism and discrimination that wear on those who bear their brunt. Whether it's a bag held extra tight as another approaches or a rude exchange at a counter, we often allow implicit biases against others to guide our actions. This book gives us a chance to contemplate how we may be complicit in forms of oppression, even implicitly, and what we might do personally to combat forms of oppression. Lastly, this book is important because it dares us to listen closely to others and to ourselves, to orchestrate harmony where there once was discord.
And what I find in this research and in this book is that I'm very imperfect. I'm a very imperfect listener. I'm more of a talker. And I've had to force myself, and really the PhD in qualitative research helped me by interviewing college presidents for hours and hours and hours and hours. I've had to force myself to listen. And what we have found in this science of autoethnography, which is the stories of lives, the deep, real, lived stories of lives, is that when we listen to them, that's the challenge, but when we listen to them, they can transform our heart.
That's right. And I think we also got to remember that we're not infallible. Even reading this, which I still kind of like this. But still, I feel like I've grown in those 5 years, and there's stuff I'd probably say differently. Like I thought I had it all figured out then, but I'm still learning and getting as I listen more and hear more stories and realizing that, I didn't have it all. Like I didn't have it all figured out.
Here's my internal challenge and challenge for people of color. How can I listen to more deeply the stories of the terrorists on January 6th and understand the challenge that their identity has gone through in the past 8 to 12 years? How can I be that compassionate?
I don't think I have an answer for you. I mean, to be honest, but they really feel like you're trying to take something away from them. I imagine. I mean, I haven't had the chance to talk to them personally, but that does seem, the idea that something's going to be taken away, the idea that their success hasn't been earned, that something's been given to them, and now people are trying to take away what they've earned. I mean, I think that's part of it, but yeah, that's a really good question, but a tough one.
One of the things that I've been hearing, and we have an activity in this book where we teach teachers about this concept of affinity identity, where your identity is wrapped up into another group. Many people have tattoos of USA on their shoulder. So when you hear critical race theory says that USA is racist, well, that means you're racist. And that hurts. I got this tattoo. It's part of my identity. So I want to work and fight against that. But what I believe, because I love America, is that you can hold love of country in one hand and also hold the reality of the horrors of our history in the other. And that's what we're trying to push.
And and I think trying to deny those horrors of the past is not a real understand. You can't love America if you don't understand it, and if you're not willing to grapple with with slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, continuing racism and discrimination, then you don't understand America, and I don't think you can love it without that fuller understanding.
And what I've been thinking recently, I've been reading this book, the 5 Love Languages, and I've been thinking about how can we listen to people like we would listen to a loving spouse, and how can we listen to different cultures and different types of people that you never listened to before. You know, my wife, she handed me this book the other day. She said, "You can improve on listening too, Drakeford." And I looked deeply at the book, and I was like, you know what? I can. And here's some of the points in it. Maintain eye contact when you're talking to your spouse. We have teachers in the classroom that don't maintain eye contact with the student as the student's giving their real narrative of their real experience. Do not listen to your spouse and do something else at the same time, like watch TV. So I think also, as we've been given these, listen, black people for hundreds of years have wrote plays, wrote musicals, books, movies about the black experience and racism. And I think now what we're asking for is listening to these deep and rich narrative stories beyond the one story of George Floyd, right? A deeper experience into black culture. And from that deeper experience, what sprouts up is love. These black people are beautiful. They're strong. They're intelligent. They have community. They have systems of economy that can't even be broken by the deepness of racism, which is entrenched in the economy.
Yeah, and I think I think your point that the stories are out there and have been out there. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, like that. I mean, if you wanted to learn about the black experience as a non-black person, there's been avenues for 100 years to do that, and there's more and more. Like, I'm thinking about Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Like, there's so much out there, and there's a lot you can learn from reading those books. As a white person, I'll never fully understand that, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot to learn that you can get from that. And it's reading, listening. I mean, I think what you're talking about, like this kind of deep listening, meaningful listening, I think that's a path to get there.
So you're listening to Dr. Derrick Drakeford and Dr. Warren Christian here on WNCU 90.7. This is the first of 4 talks on race for Black History Month. We're excited to be here, and we're glad that you're listening. In the book, another thing that I've learned is we have to observe body language. You know, there's a attack on black bodies.
Yeah.
That's really what the Black Lives Matter movement means, is that black bodies are being attacked, killed. Growing up, hearing the statistic that a black male had a 1 in 5 chance of being murdered before age 25 was scary. That was part of my narrative growing up in Chapel Hill, Carborough, and Durham. So what can we do about this? Listen, I got some homework for everyone. I'm a teacher. Forgive me. I apologize. I got some homework. And what I want you to do this afternoon, tonight, is to write down your autoethnography. Autoethnography is your life story, your story from your cultural lens, from your point of view. This is your homework, to write down this story. And what you're going to find out in the story is interwoven pain and suffering and challenges. And then I want you to take that story, and I want you to have courage enough to share it with one person. And what you're going to find out is it's difficult, to be honest. It's difficult to tell your story. It's difficult to delve into the pain that you've gone through. But once that other person hears the story, there's going to be an instant connection. Trust is built. through vulnerability, through the ability to be honest and genuine and to be myself, which is what we call the art of story listening. So that's your homework today, Dr. Warren.
I'm sorry, we got the book right here. I got to ask. So what's your love language? Sorry.
Physical touch and words of affirmation.
Okay. Sorry. So don't forget your homework. Write your autoethnography. Share it with one person. When's this due?
It's due tomorrow.
Do it
it's
tonight.
due tomorrow.
Gotcha.
But what you're going to find in that activity and what we found, we've now trained professors around the country. We did a training with 130 faculty at Los Angeles City College, the largest community college in LA. And when we trained these 130 faculty, the thing that was most difficult for them was this concept of being vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I don't like talking about myself. I don't want to share my autoethnography.
And we as teachers have been taught to be the thinker in the classroom, the voice on note in the classroom, when we're not the smartest person in the classroom.
That's right. I mean, I think when you are vulnerable in front of your students, when you can share parts of yourself, that opens them up to sharing parts of themselves that you weren't going to get otherwise. And without that, what are you doing if you're not getting to that place?
So one of the things that we talk about in the book is we do an activity called Finding Your Purpose in 15 Minutes, which really delves the listener into what's my passion, what's my pain, who are the people that I care about. And after you answer these questions, it's your life story. It is your narrative. And that is our perspective, or how we are looking at critical race theory today, is through the tenet of counter storytelling. Now, in legal arguments, counter storytelling is used to bring a narrative opposed to the dominant narrative to make a legal argument in a legal case. Delgado is the author of this concept of counter storytelling. So another question that we have is, how can white people, and I'm going to ask this to you, Warren, since you look white, how can white people help in the teaching and the learning of critical race theory in Black history?
I mean, so I think the point we touched on earlier about listening, and again, listening deeply, listening meaningfully, finding those stories. I mean, and again, like we said, these stories are out there. They have been out there. So I think I think being willing to engage in the conversation. I think there's a lot of folks who don't want to talk about race and racism, don't want to talk about white supremacy. They might be ashamed. I mean, there's a lot of feelings that come up around that, and it's certainly easier to just avoid it. Well, I'm not racist. This doesn't apply to me. I'm kind of outside of this. But if you're unwilling to talk about it, it's hard to imagine any growth happening. It's hard to imagine educating anyone about race and race in the U.S. So I think first, just a willingness to listen and a willingness to talk about it, a willingness to make mistakes, ask questions, a willingness to, at times, say the wrong thing and learn from that. And I think that's a big part of it. I think.
What's this term, ally? I hear this term a lot. What does that mean?
That term doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Because to me, that's a little too far removed. Like, ally somewhat sounds to me like someone who's, to be blunt, like doesn't know any Black people or isn't friends or family with any Black people. So that's not a term I subscribe to. I'm happy for folks to be allies. That's great. It's better than nothing. But I wonder if you might be able to do a little more than be an ally. So that's,
Now, you serve on a board at UNC.
Yes, I'm on a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, yeah.
What was it in you, kind of in the recondite fiber of your spirit, that sparked you to say you wanted to join their board?
This I expressed interest after the Nicole Hannah-Jones debacle. I mean, speaking of banning CRT, her 1619 project, which I don't think by the traditional definition is a part of critical race theory, but it is like kind of this new definition that's been forced onto us by the folks who want to ban it, an honest telling of slavery, an honest telling of white supremacy, an honest telling of the history of racism in the U.S., and the centrality of racism in the U.S. When UNC revoked the tenure offer to her, quite frankly, I wanted to quit. I wanted to quit in protest.
Wow.
And then I thought about it more, and I came to the unfortunate realization that I don't think many people would care if I quit. I mean, that's just the way it is. No one was going to beg me to stay was my biggest fear. And so joining this committee was, well, let's see what happens. Let's see is what are the avenues for change within the university to make it a less racist space.
Now, when I was at Carolina, Silent Sam was on the yard. What are your thoughts on Silent Sam?
Good riddance. I'm glad he's gone. I'm glad he ain't coming back. I mean, that's the other. Besides all that, the community did what needed to be done there, but the university's plan to give $2.5 million to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, who is a hate group. I mean, they are a white supremacist hate group in my eyes. Your idea was to give them $2.5 million. That doesn't feel like the kind of place I want to be.
Yeah, and then that kind of goes back to how interwoven, which is one of the tenets in critical race theory, is the prominence of racism interwoven into so many fabrics of our society, including my alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill. So, listen, I'm enjoying this conversation, man. I can't wait until we get to the second half of the show and more into the book. I'm Dr. Derrick Drakeford, along with Dr. Warren Christian. We're talking today about critical race theory from an education lens. And this is a special Lunch and Learn show here on WNCU 90.7 FM. We'll be back after the break. This is the first of 4 Lunch and Learn programs for Black History Month here on WNCU 90.7 FM. I'm here along with English language specialist Dr. Warren Christian to talk about critical race theory and the book, Inclusion, The Art of Story Listening. And before we went to the break, we were talking about what can white people do? And you really wanted to expand on that as our expert white person on not only the teaching and learning, but kind of in the everyday lifestyle. We go fishing together. We hang out together. What are some other things that white people can do?
I mean, so first, I think just starting from a place of if you truly believe that talent, that basically that all people are kind of inherently equal, people of different races, if you think talent is kind of spread evenly amongst all people, which and if you don't, like that's an explicitly racist idea. So if you do think that folks are inherently equal across all races, ethnicities, then if you look at the current disparities in the U.S. in education, in wealth, I think wealth is probably one of the biggest ones, in rates of incarceration, in health. If you see that and you believe people are equal, then you got to ask yourself, well, what's going on? And the answer is, to me, it's pretty easy. It's racism. It's white supremacy.
Systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
And what is, because racism is traditionally seen on an individual basis, one-on-one, person-to-person, discriminatory interaction. But really, racism is interwoven into structures. So it's a more complex, really what CRT is a more complex view of racism.
That's right, and that it's both of those things. And just to this idea, if you see these disparities, then if you doing nothing isn't an option. Doing nothing isn't going to get rid of the disparities. Even just, I think to paraphrase Malcolm X, you got to first take the knife out and then heal the wound.
You better paraphrase Malcolm X.
You can't, if you just taking the knife out doesn't end it. So even ending day-to-day racism, the disparities have been baked in, and they need to, quite frankly, they need to be repaired.
So it's hard for me to tell other people, hey, you need to confess. You need to tell your story of when you messed up. You need to let people know when you've fallen short, unless I do the same. Mm-hmm. So I'm reading now from chapter 12 in the book Inclusion, The Art of Story Listening. The name of the chapter is Confession That Heals. Confess your faults to one another and pray for one another, and ye may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man or woman availeth much. I have failed. As I sit here thinking about a recent lapse, I realize I have a lot of work still to be done on my journey to becoming an inclusive leader. It was months ago when I was recruiting co-collaborators for this book. I was watching the news on June 27th, sitting on my couch, eating chips, and I heard a comment by a national political figure. It was during an event honoring the Navajo veterans, when the political figure turned the ceremony into a juvenile sideshow comedy act. He said, "You," motioning to the Navajo veterans, "were here long before any of us were here. Although we have a representative in Congress who's been here a long time, longer than you. They call her Pocahontas." The national political figure was insulting Representative Elizabeth Warren, who has claimed to have Native American roots. I can't lie, Warren, even as I'm reading this now, I can't lie. There was part of me that when I heard the racial slur, subconsciously part of me laughed. There was something in me that connected with that visceral, debased, and immature, insensitive joke. Was it implicit bias? Maybe it was my middle school days when we, the black male students, would wait for the public school bus and crack jokes on each other. We used all the creative genius and brain power we could to muster to find the new and innovative your mama joke. It was in the middle, yes, it was this middle school kid inside of me who was never taught about the Trail of Tears or how alcohol and gambling has been used as a weapon to decimate indigenous communities. The middle school kid in me, Warren, who had never listened to the narratives of Native Americans who were hurt by the name of the Washington Pro football team. It was the kid in me who never learned about the genius of the Navajo code talkers, who in 1942 developed the only code for battlefield radio transmission that was never broken. I to be a mature adult. In that private split second of chuckling, I failed to be compassionate, inclusive, and thoughtful. Here I was teaching teachers and executives how to be more inclusive. And this mean, selfish part of me wanted to laugh. It was attempting to normalize laughing at someone else's expense. I said to myself, but my failure was private. No one had to know. I could just sweep it under the rug and not spend time reflecting and critiquing myself. But that thought was wrong. What I needed to do was to be critical and expose myself to the shame of failing. It is only when it hurts that I can become more vigilant and more intentional about guarding my mental processes and removing my subconsciousness and sometimes race consciousness sense of humor. What makes my actions shameful to me is that Elizabeth Warren is one of the few heroes in the Congress who not only understands the damage of racial division has done to our country, but she is also not afraid to call out white supremacy, bigotry, and racism. Elizabeth Warren was story silenced by the Senate, who voted 49-43 to admonish and effectively bar her from speaking during the remaining debate of a nominee for Attorney General. Warren was escorted out of the congressional hearing because she read aloud a letter from Miss Coretta Scott King, indicating the racially discriminatory past of the nominee for Attorney General. Warren's rebuke is an example of what happens when racially deaf ears refuse to story listen. So that's my confession, man.
I think that's really powerful, this idea that we have room for growth, and clearly, I mean, like, it's clear in the story that you've learned from this, and you've grown from this, and you've grown past it. I mean, I think that the idea of this being kind of like a private failing, I mean, this is, to me, this is very much like an implicit bias thing, and also goes to show another way that racism and white supremacy is so ingrained in us as Americans.
It's in our comedy.
It's in our comedy, and it's also in our heads and in our thoughts. But to me, the comforting thing is, first of all, to acknowledge that these kind of implicit racist thoughts are going to happen. Mm-hmm. Like, you could try to train yourself out of it, but it's difficult and perhaps even impossible to get rid of it totally. You're not always totally in control of the thoughts that come into your head, how you react to seeing someone. But what you are in control of is your actions, and I can interrogate my thoughts. So if I see a black person and my reaction is, oh, I'm scared, I can interrogate that thought. I don't have to act on that fear, but I can acknowledge it and think about what's causing that. Is this actually a scary situation? How much is race and racism and white supremacy playing into this fear I'm experiencing right now? And if I can do that, then I can tell myself a counter story to counter this idea of fear, and also the idea that we can, we don't, just because we sense we're afraid, we don't have to necessarily act on that fear. That fear may not be warranted. That fear might be based in racism and white supremacy.
There's a recent study, a FMRI brain study, where they connected these brain fMRI pieces to the brains of 1,250 executives, white male executives. And they just showed these executives different pictures of different types of people. And when they showed the executive the picture of the black male, the part of the brain for fear went off in the brain. Now here it is, all they are seeing is a picture.
Yep.
And the part of the brain for fear goes off. So why is this? Part of our brains are wired where, listen, if it's 10 p.m. at night and I'm walking down the alley and I see another brother with a hoodie on, my alert's going to go up. But the challenge in our DNA and brains is that if it's 10 a.m. and I'm at the interview desk and a brother comes in with a suit to interview, that same part of the brain goes off.
Yep.
And I don't know why he didn't get the job. I just didn't feel comfortable.
It wasn't a fit.
It wasn't a fit. Mm-hmm. So what this book teaches these hiring managers is to take 10 seconds. What the brain does, in the first 10 seconds, it will tell you fear. But after 10 seconds, you can then reprogram your brain to say, I wonder what his story is.
Yeah.
I wonder what his narrative is. And when you ask yourself, I wonder what his story is, it freezes your brain long enough not to replace it with a stereotype.
Yeah.
So that's our solution focus to critical race theory. It's inclusion, the art of story listening. What's your story, Warren?
Well, can you be more specific?
I'm always interested in how people kind of got to where they got to.
Mm-hmm.
You got a PhD in education from Carolina. What kind of propelled you into that direction?
That's, I'm afraid it might not be the most interesting story, but I taught in Japan after undergraduate.
Why are you laughing?
I guess I wasn't expecting this question. But
you taught in Japan.
Taught in Japan, came back, lived in LA, ran out of money. Time to come back home to North Carolina. Looked at a list of degrees, programs at UNC, and thought, well, education. There you go.
It must be nice to be white. I don't know how y'all got it good. You just looked at a list and said, oh, Lord. You know what I had to do to get into Carolina?
Which time?
Listen, when I got into the PhD program, there was 135 students.
Mm-hmm.
There was one black male student.
Yep.
So when the conversation come up in class, everybody looking, Drakeford, what do they think about this? And it was difficult for me to navigate that space. And, what we have found in the education space, and I write about it in this book here, I've got a chapter called The Dross of Gold. The Dross of Gold. Gold is a precious metal. And gold has this rubbish that grows on top of it called dross.
Mm-hmm.
And I analogize that to the American educational system in the South. Because what the research finds, schools like Chapel Hill High School, where I went to high school, the white students do excellent.
Yep.
And the students of color get rubbish education.
Yeah.
So on that gold, there's two elements. One is gold, because part of the white history story is a bunch of white great men
mm-hmm.
and great women. And it feeds your identity. It feeds your self-esteem. So you come out of Chapel Hill High School with confidence, self-belief, and pride.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing when the American flag go up, you see part of your identity in there. But black students who come out, if they come out, mm-hmm. because the majority of them are labeled LD. I was at Chapel Hill, I was labeled learning disability.
Mm.
So when I was taking the test, I could take the test with the book open. As a kid, I'm thinking, wow, this is cool. But as an educator, I'm thinking it was dulling my mind.
Yeah.
It was dumbing me down. The other students had to compute in their mind. I had a calculator.
Mm-hmm.
So the other students were learning, and my standards were lowered because I was a student of color. So right there, gold had dross and gold together. So what's the solution? Because this show is about solutions. It's to burn the gold. And the burning of the gold, or putting the dross in the fire, is the fire of honesty. It's the honest narrative, just like the one I gave, that burns a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean the power of education and the importance of education, I think is so powerful, and has been one of the ways that racism has been kind of kept going in the U.S. But I also want to caution against the idea that we can educate our way out of this, and that this is a problem that is a problem with just education, or something that schooling and education alone can fix. Because I think since the foundation of the U.S., it's been so unequal and the starting points are so different that I think it takes more than that. I mean, I think there's hope. I think to me, the monuments coming down recently is a great thing. The Confederate monuments all over the U.S. starting to come down is
if you're just
a terrific
tuning
development.
In.
But I think
Did I cut you off?
It's more than that. You have to equal out the playing field. You also have to heal the wound. And to me, honestly, like where I'm turning now is we need a federal big-time reparations program to equal out the wealth inequality. Without that, I think that's just necessary, and that's something that I think we need to. We've talked about monuments, we've talked about other stuff. Like, let's get down to it.
Reparations is the way to go. Forget the monument. I'll take the check.
Yes.
And why will I take the check? Because historically, I have not been able to get a business loan. It's easier for me to get a car loan than a business loan. So there's historic racism in lending in businesses, redlining in homes.
That's right. And there's been real financial harm. So I think cash payments to descendants of enslaved folks is honestly what's necessary. I don't think you can, even if you can magically end racism tomorrow, the deep wealth inequality in the U.S. between black and white folks, that's not just going to go away. That's not something that's going to go away on its own, and it needs action.
An 8-year-old black kid can tell there's a connection between economics and race in America.
Yeah.
You're tuned in to Dr. Derrick Drakeford along with Warren Christian. We're talking about critical race theory on this special Lunch and Learn show here on WNCU 90.7. 8-year-old kid has a deeper understanding of the connections between economy and race than many middle-aged white people.
Yeah, and I think that's so. There's so many examples of successful black folks who are making it, and we can see a lot of narratives around success of folks from all races. But still, when you look at the numbers, is the averages, the wealth inequality is just stark and persistent, and unwavering. It's not getting better.
And you don't have to look at the statistics. You could drive around your town.
That's right.
Whatever town you in, drive around it, and you can see racial inequality and economic inequality. And the only way that is going to be fixed is we got to not only take the knife out, but we have to have some kind of redress in the healing process. And that's going to look at the court system. How are we healing the court system? Mm-hmm. Look at the education system. How are we burning off the dross and giving every person, every child, a golden education that says you're beautiful, you're talented, you're smart, you belong mm-hmm. here, your voice belongs here, we need you here. Stay in school. So how do we create equity? And I think, that's really what this show is. It's about this concept of light. Mm-hmm. And when you learn something new, there's a word called enlightenment. And really, light goes off in your head when you are enlightened. So as we're talking about life now in 2022, under oppression, where is the light to the way out?
I think that's such a great question, such an important question. I think we can. It's really tough now that we do have these, that you can't. In one way, maybe this is in a strange way, the explicit racist actions of the folks, the January 6th folks, the Charlottesville neo-Nazis, Nazis, KKK, avowed white supremacists. it makes it so we can't deny the problem anymore. I mean, maybe when Obama was our president, you could deny it and say, well, it's getting better on its own. But I mean, one thing hopefully the avowed white supremacists might be doing, I hope they're overplaying their hand, and that people will see. I mean, this is a big hope, and I hope this isn't a naive hope, but that people will recognize that racism and white supremacy are still very much an issue, and that redress needs to happen, and needs to happen now before we can move forward.
And I agree that reparations is the macro answer. But the micro answer, for me, it was going to Chapel Hill High School, and in 11th grade, I had only been assigned one black author from K through 11. And that was by a black male teacher who forced me to read the black male author, which was Frederick Douglass. And here I was, and we're going toward what's the answer? What's the light? Here I was as a student reading Frederick Douglass's narrative, his counter story, his life story. The Narrative of a Life of Frederick Douglass. If you haven't read the book, get it today. It changed my life. And what I learned was here was this young black boy who could not read. And he would take pieces of bread and trade it with white kids for the lesson that they got in school that day. He'd say, well, tell me what you learned in school that day. Here, take this sandwich. And the white kids were hungry. They would eat the sandwich, and they would tell him what they learned in school that day, and that is how he taught himself how to read. And here I was in high school clowning off. So you ask, what is the light? The light is finding narratives that will change the recondite fiber of your being. And in order to find those narratives, you need to listen to more narratives. And we need to write more narratives. And we need to learn more counter stories. And when we look at the whole essence of critical race theory, that's where I believe the solutions are. This concept of counter storytelling, which can then move us to some policy like what you're saying in reparations.
Well, and I think beyond that, you got to do everything you just said, but you also have to do something. Yeah. Whatever it is, if you're in a position to hire people, hire black people. If you're in a position to promote people, promote black people.
Come on.
Like Issa Rae, we're rooting for everyone black.
Hey.
That's what it takes. The field doesn't even out itself.
We are
so
rooting
what can
for
you do?
everyone black.
If you can assign black authors, do that. What can you do? Doing nothing. I mean, I think this is largely taken from How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi's. Doing nothing is racist. Doing nothing changes nothing. So what can you do? What are the avenues that you have where you can promote racial inequality, where you can work to lessen some of the disparities, so many of the disparities present?
What's your advice to the teachers who have kind of become under fire because of critical race theory? If you're a high school history teacher, what's your advice?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think this is from Linda Stone at UNC, one of the great faculty there.
The great Linda Stone.
Survive and subvert. So first, you've got to survive. You can't, if you get fired, you can't help.
That's why you didn't quit.
That's why I didn't quit. You're gonna have to, or at least you're gonna have to find a different way to help. You're not gonna be in the classroom if you get fired. So survive and subvert. What are the ways that you can subvert the system while still surviving? Surviving, keeping your job, but also surviving your own well-being. I mean, you also got to take care of yourself. So what are you able to do, and what's too much?
Survive and subvert. I like it. Slow down. Calm down. They're not the enemy. They're the friend. And when you turn an enemy into a friend, you got a friend to the end. If you didn't know, I'm Dr. Derrick Drakeford. And you've been listening to the first. I think we kicked off the month pretty well.
I hope so. I hope so.
You've been listening to the first of 4 Black History Month Lunch and Learn programs. Today we talked about critical race theory and the art of story listening and the book Inclusion, the Art of Story Listening here on WNCU 90.7 FM. Listen, a special thanks to English specialist Dr. Warren Christian, and I appreciate your being here. Thank you, audience, for listening. Join us February 10th next week for Mounting the Fight Against Jim Crow, featuring the wonderful historians Dr. Carlton Wilson and Dr. Freddie Parker. We're out.